We can start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second session, the second meeting in our series on writing orality. As you know, if you have attended the last meeting, our aim is to favor cross-pollination between different scholars working, scholars working in different fields across different early text cultures. And to this end, we pair essentially two talks and two people working on similar topics. Today, we're going to focus on very different sets of sources, obviously, and we've got two presenters. It is my pleasure to introduce the first of our two speakers today, Samira Lynch. She has just completed a DPhil with a thesis entitled Prayer as Performance, and she's interested mostly in how the material text shapes the reception and performance of the narratives that it frames. So without further ado, I'm very happy and honored to leave the floor to Samira. So please, Samira, take it away.
Thank you. And I'm very grateful to be invited to give a talk here. It's been a really great opportunity, and I would very much like to thank the board for approving my presentation. The first thing I'd like to note is that I uploaded 3 documents into the shared Google Drive folder. Only one of them is the handout for this talk. The other 2 are just the prologue to the text I'm discussing and its translation. I uploaded these simply because this text has never been edited before. And I'm currently editing it. So if you just wanted to get a feel for the style of the text and its content, you could read through it, but that's not obligatory for this talk and you don't have to have read it. And of course, like following the sort of informal structure of these meetings, this isn't going to be a sort of really in detailed academic close reading of the punctuation and the narrative style of this text, but it's more intended to sort of introduce the genre and introduce the concept of writing orality in medieval sermons or texts that invoke sermons, and to invite us to discuss a number of topics surrounding this theme. So specifically what my talk wants to look at is exploring the art of texts that invoke themselves as writing orality, and how their literary techniques are either supported by or conflict with the presentation and the layout, what Malcolm Parks has called the ordinatio of their manuscripts. So medieval sermons are excellent sources for investigating questions both of writing orality and of performing the written word in historical texts. As practical working documents, sermons are texts that are primarily intended to be performed, capturing their audience's attention and persuading them to internalize and retain the moral and religious teaching that the preacher seeks to impart. Sermons frequently contain a variety of different modes of oral delivery, interspersing the preacher's narrative with moral tales known as exemplar, lyrics, and quotations from authoritative sources such as the Bible or the Church Fathers. And many of these exemplar are often intended to appeal to sort of everyday people. They can be quite rude, they can have like sexual undertones, they can be jokes, or they can be very straight-laced moral tales. There's a huge variety of them. But as written texts, sermons simultaneously invoke an almost antithetical method of reception, being recommended to or copied in manuscripts suggestive of private reading, thus engaged with by an individual removed from the dynamics of receiving preaching in a group. Manuscripts of medieval sermons can reflect these 2 complementary yet contradictory modes of reception. And furthermore, a significant number of sermons that survive are not preserved in sort of full prose texts, but in a form of note-taking known as reportationes, literally sort of reports, which make their texts more witnesses to an audience's written impression of performed orality, rather than a sort of constructed method of writing orality as we would receive it. And what I'd like to show in this talk as well is that the sermons are an excellent genre that is underexplored to consider writing orality in a historical sense. So many sermons and sermon-like texts, like the one I'm editing here, have never been edited. And many of the more recent editions of the genre are of vernacular sermons, primarily sermons in Middle English, even though the majority of sermons are in Latin. And Siegfried Wenzel, who is by far the authority on the genre, has shown that Latin sermons were often preached or translated extempore into other languages, even though they were written down in Latin. And then so apart from Wenzel's work, most sermons have been studied as sources for other works than as works in their own right. So for example, Bella Millett, who is perhaps a foremost scholar on Ancrina Wissa, studied a lot of French sermons composed in the early 13th century from the Paris school, but she was mostly looking at how they presented medieval marriage and how these concepts of marriage sort of fitted into Ancrina Wissa and the Christ bride metaphor, rather than looking at the sermons as sort of literary text or creative text in their own right. And this is despite the fact that sermons were a very popular and highly stylized mode of writing in the Middle Ages. So for example, Michelle McCarthy in First the Bow was Bent in Study has shown the vast amount of sources and learning available to medieval friars and how this fed into the sermons that they composed. And the final section of this talk will focus on questions of writing orality in the modern sense, namely we as editors and consumers of edited texts rewrite medieval orality and reflect this orality on the page. This ties in not only with my own editing of the Compileison, but also seeks to open up a discussion of how we as scholars can write orality going forward. So I am looking at one of the 5 treatises of a text now known as the Compileison for the Religious Life. It's perhaps the most significant Anglo-Norman work that has yet to be edited. It runs to roughly 29,000 lines of manuscript text and contains 5 main sermons or compilaisons, which can be technically translated as compilation. We have the Compilaison de Sin Mortu Péché, the 7 deadly sins, de Saint Penance, of holy penance, de Peine de Purgatorie, the pains of purgatory, de Dis Commandements, the 10 commandments, and the Vie de gens de religion, the life of religious people or people in holy orders. And I'm looking at the 4th treatise, the Dis Commandements, which is about the 10 commandments. This is the only treatise that has never appeared in print, even partially or in full, mostly because the other treatises have been only selectively edited because they contain excerpts from Ancrina Wissa, which is a more famous work and thus more appealing, one assumes, to editors of these texts. But in addition to having all of these amazing qualities of written orality, treatises on the Decalogue, Leslie Smith argues, present some of the clearest examples of how medieval scholars interpreted the Bible as speaking to the everyday world in their use of everyday examples, and often in telling people what to do and what not to do reflects the social morality of the context in which they were written. It is the study of the Decalogue, she continues, that allows us to look at the ordinary of a long-gone society. So, composed between 1254 and 1274, the Compileison de Dis Commandements is a Norman French text that is ideally suited to exploring questions of orality and performance. Originally composed by a Franciscan friar, it consistently accompanies each reference to a reader with one to a listener. And if you look in your handouts, the first section of the text that I've put there, we have people who read this text or hear it read by someone else. And every single reference to a reader in this text across all 5 treatises of the Compileison also has one to a listener. And in addition to the first person voice of the narrator and the genre of the text, the Compileison uses polyvocality to great effect in order to engage the instructor's audience. So in the prologue alone, for example, which is the section that I uploaded, we hear the voices of the narrator, the audience, David, God, Christ, and a dramatized version of the parable of the rich man from Matthew 19. Its manuscripts also indicate its expected oral reception and realization. They are heavily punctuated, with the punctuation notably being corrected and emended in 2 of the 3 versions. And one of the manuscripts, Bodley 654, primarily contains other sermons in Latin. And I'm going to talk more about the manuscripts in a moment. As such, we can consider not only the question of voices and personae in the narrative, but also explore the realization of ideal versus real written inscriptions of orality, as seen both in the speeches of the narrative and how they are punctuated and presented to their audiences. So if we look at the Compileison, the section that I've given on the handout, we can see that this is an example of a text whose speech is full of dramatic orality. So this is the first thing that the audience would have heard when hearing the Compileison de Dis Commandements or reading the Compileison de Dis Commandements. And as a result, it kind of establishes a tone for the scene. And I will read it in translation in order to simplify things. Here begins the prologue of the compilation about the 10 commandments. It has 3 paragraphs. This is the book of God's commandments and the law that is forever. All those who keep it shall come into life, and those who abandon it to death. To his dearest brothers and sisters in God, to all of the men and women who read this text or hear it read by someone else, greetings and good health to the soul and the body in the sweet Jesus who is our true savior. We speak to you by the grace of God in this compilation about the 10 commandments as we have learned it in Holy Scripture. May God grant that we do this for the salvation of souls. Amen. So this is the first sort of paragraph. So the interesting thing you see here is that we have a language or a lexicon of words involving preaching. We speak to you, and then later it says we will tell you, we will outline for you. We have a dynamic of nous and vous, we versus you, and the audience, of course, is implied as plural, which is another interesting point. This kind of greeting is called a salutatio, a kind of formal introduction to a text, which establishes the dynamic for the rest of it. And if you look in the prologue, throughout the prologue and the rest of the Compileison, this text actually has a very unique feature, which is that all of the quotations from scripture or other sources have speech tags. It will often say things like DPhil, he said, as the psalmist said in the Gospels, and then a quotation, he said, and complete the quotation. And the interesting thing as well is that these speech tags are also mirrored in Latin. So it will be something like a quotation, then inquid, and then the rest of the quotation. So there's very much an emphasis on sort of speech and received speech. And this is very unusual for texts of this time, to not only have these speech tags consistently, but also to have them in the Latin as well as in the vernacular. So this is very much a text that kind of wants to construct this idea of orality and receiving orality. And another interesting source, which I didn't include on the handout, but which is later in the text, is how the author or the compiler tries to vivify the sources that he's using. So, for example, later in the Compileison, he retells the story of Praetexta from Jerome's 107th letter, in which a young maiden is forced by her mother to do her hair in a sort of sexy way in order to get married, even though Praetexta has sworn herself to Christ. The woman's mother, Praetexta, is then sort of visited by an angel who tells her that for doing up her daughter like this, she's a horrible woman and is going to hell. And this is to kind of show that a good true virgin of Christ is always modest and modestly attired. But what we can do to look at sort of how this text vivifies and dramatizes the delivery of this is to compare the angel speech in Jerome's letter as it was originally written with Jerome's speech, this version of the angel speech in the Compileison. And I'm going to read both in translation, again, just to speed things up. So in Jerome's letter, the angel says, have you presumed to put your husband's commands before those of Christ? Have you presumed to lay your hand upon the head of God's virgin? Your hand shall immediately wither, so that you might know what you have done. And at the end of 5 months, you shall be carried off to hell. And further, if you persist still in your wickedness, you shall be bereaved of both your husband and of your children. All of which came to pass in 2 time, her death marking the penitence too long delayed of an unhappy woman. So that's the original. And then this is how the text is rendered in the Compileison. Vous escromange femme, you hideous woman, why have you made yourself more obedient to your Lord than to God? And you have touched the test of the head of God's maiden with your disgusting hands. And for this you shall now have more slander, for your hand shall wither away as you deserve. And if you don't repent immediately and amend your misdeed, you will lose your Lord, and your children shall die, and you yourself shall die within these 6 months, most horribly, and you all shall go to hell. And si comme il dit, tout ici a vie. And just as he said, it all happened. So you see here, you also have the kind of retelling of the sources in order to make them sort of more dramatic, more appealing, and more punchy in a sense, to kind of more resonate with the audience. An interesting thing here is if you wanted to, you could compare the style of the Compileison with Ancrina Wissa, one of its main sources. They're both composed by sort of authors from fraternal backgrounds. It's largely believed now that Ancrina Wissa was composed by Dominican friar and the Compileison by Franciscan, and the 2 orders did indeed share works and things like that. And they use much the same rhetorical techniques, the author speaking to the audience, the first person, the use of exemplar and quotations. But the interesting thing is that Ancrina Wissa, although it evokes orality, is never really treated as an oral text. It's always described as a treatise or a book, perhaps because it's written for enclosed women, although we do have very early contemporary manuscripts of Ancrina Wissa suggesting wider audiences. So that's another interesting point to consider. So far, you might think, well, this is clearly a text that's originally meant to be performed aloud. This is very clearly a text that is written orality. However, it's not that straightforward, and now we're going to turn to differences between the 3 versions and to their manuscripts. So, for example, the Compileison always describes itself as un écrit, something written, a writing, a narrative. or a compilaison, a compilation. It never describes itself as a sermon. And then if we look at the manuscript, so this is a different page of the manuscript, but this is one of the pages of the manuscript. And let's see. So this is the Trinity manuscript, which is the one I'm using as the base text for my critical edition. As you can see here, the text is very much constructed as something that's meant to be read. We have marginal citations for the sources of Latin text boxed around in the margin in red ink. Latin writing is underlined in red, furthermore, to separate it. If you look here, we have rubrics written into the text, and we have running titles along the bottom of each page. And this 2-column layout with wide margins was also a kind of style of manuscript that was considered typical of things like histories and chronicles and other sort of long narrative pieces. I'll leave that up on the screen for you for a bit. And the interesting thing is, if you look on your handout at the first thing in French, we have here, si ad, however many paragraphs. It has this many paragraphs, and this is again a rubric, a style of rubric that I believe is unique to the Compilaison. I've never encountered another text that tells you in each section how many paragraphs it has. And obviously, if you're hearing a text read, you wouldn't necessarily think about it in terms of paragraphs. And so the marginal citations, the underlining of the Latin and all these things sort of suggests that the text might invoke orality, but it's not straightforwardly meant to be an oral text, at least in the Trinity manuscript. And the Paris manuscript, which is another one, which is the other manuscript contemporary with it, looks almost identical to the Trinity manuscript. It also has the running titles, the marginal citations, the rubrics, the 2 columns. However, the third manuscript, Bodley 654, which is not online, unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it, is very different. Bodley 654 is written in 1 single column of narrative text. There's not 2 columns. The Latin citations are not underlined. There are no marginal citations. There are fewer rubrics, and the rubrics are not as large. And so you might think that the Bodley text might be presented more for someone to deliver. And the interesting thing as well is the compilation of the 2 manuscripts. So in Trinity and Paris, all 5 treatises of the Compilaison are really the only text in the manuscript, and they are single volume books created just to sort of present the Compilaison. However, in the Bodley manuscript, the Compilaison and the preceding Compilaison, De Peine de Purgatorie, are the only French text in the entire manuscript, and the rest of the manuscript contains sermons in Latin addressed to fratres carissimi, dear brothers, suggesting that this manuscript was used for preaching to friars or perhaps to monastic audiences. But the interesting thing is that both the Paris and the Trinity text of the Compilaison assume as broad an audience as possible. So we saw in our handout to all the men and the women, Issos et Celles, the Bodley manuscript, wherever Trinity and Paris have Issos et Celles, the Bodley manuscript will only have Celles. So it's addressed solely to women. And then if we look at the other text in the manuscript, it hints that it could be used to preach to women or to religious women. So the text that immediately follows the Compilaison in Bodley 654 is a Latin text with the rubric ad sacerdotes quomodo laicum populum debent instruere, to priests on how they must teach lay people. And it talks about how you should preach, when you should preach, and how you should always be engaging to ensure that your audience pay attention. And then one of the texts preceding the Compilaison, it's called Sex Rationibus debet mulier magisterium diligere quan homo, 6 reasons why a woman should love God more than another man. And it contains sort of reasons to sort of convince women why God is a much better husband. So for example, just as you must love heaven more than earth, so you must love the God of heaven more than a man of earth, and other such things. So this again reminds us that the orality constructed in the text might not necessarily be the orality that was delivered. So although the sermons in Latin are addressed to fratres carissimi, dear brothers, we have other texts in manuscript suggestive of preaching to women, exclusively women. And the last sort of thing I want to talk about in this context is the difference in the punctuation of the manuscripts. So if you look at your handout and you go to the, it should be number 3, I should stop sharing my screen. There we go. Sorry about that. I have the sort of 3 versions of the parable of the rich man from each of the 3 manuscripts. And if you look at them, Although the words are kind of broadly the same, the punctuation and the way the text is presented are very different. In the Trinity version, you have a lot of punctus elevati, which are the things here represented with semicolon, which prescribe a sort of rising intonation for the voice. You have a question mark, que frage peut avoir la vie pardonable, with a question mark. You have a lot more punctus points to specify pauses, much like modern commas. Whereas in the Paris version, there are far fewer punctuation marks. And as you can see, there is only, I believe, one punctus elevatus in the entire section given here. Si vous voulez être parfaitement prudent, allez vendez. All of the others are represented by punctus where they occur at all. And so you can say that the text in the Trinity version is punctuated much more heavily and much more prescriptively than in the Bodley version. And these two different modes of punctuation are discussed by Malcolm Parks in his book Pause and Effect, A History of Punctuation in the West. It's the only actual study of historical punctuation, really, and I highly recommend it if you are interested, because it is a good book to read through, and there are lots of pictures in case you get bored. But Parks says that Parks calls the first kind of thing we have in the Trinity manuscript, where the text contains a lot of different kind of punctuation marks, deictic punctuation. It's punctuation that's prescriptive and meant to guide you towards a certain kind of delivery or interpretation. Whereas the second kind we see in Bodley, which uses primarily the sort of neutral punctus throughout, Parks calls equiparative punctuation, which is more equal and which allows you to kind of impart your own sort of reading to the text. And so these kind of questions of punctuation are then very interesting to talk about when you move to editing the Compileison. So this is something that I had to bear in mind when I was producing my critical edition. And so if you want to, you can sort of compare how the three sort of A, B, and C excerpts of the same extract in my handout were all reduced into the one small paragraph in my best text critical edition. And as well as deciding how I was going to incorporate the readings of the the variant readings from the three manuscripts, I also had to decide how I was going to punctuate it. So a fun thing is that originally when I was producing this edition, I put a punctuation mark wherever the text put a punctuation mark. But Professor Wogan Brown, who was mentoring me, has been helping me with my edition, actually pointed out that in modern English, there were too many punctuation marks and the text didn't read as fluently. And so she recommended that I remove a few of them to sort of make the text more legible in modern English. And that's something I found was very interesting, in that if you're talking about the idea of written orality or transferring orality, the fact that this text might in a sense be too oral, there's too much written down, there's too much punctuation, there's too much prescription, is something, again, that I found quite interesting. And then to sort of conclude my talk, I just wanted to show you the way the parable of the rich man is worked out in this text, because I think that this is a perfect example of how the text uses sort of techniques of orality and techniques of drama in order to sort of invoke this idea of preaching and this idea of imaginative narrative performance in order to engage the audience. So the interesting thing, of course, is that the thing that you see here in the translation in the Gospels is actually in the margin. It's not part of the text. And this is something to begin with that very much reminds us that we are reading. We are not necessarily listening. But yeah, so it so happened that a man asked of him exactly what you are asking, and said to Jesus Christ, as the Gospels tell it, "Sir, what must I do to have eternal life?" And sweet Jesus replied to him and said, "If you want to come into such a life, keep the 10 commandments." And he listed some of the commandments. And the man said and replied to our Lord, "I have," he said, "kept these perfectly since my childhood." And our Lord loved him and gave him his advice. "There is one thing," he said, "that you still need to do. If you want to be an entirely worthy man, go and sell everything that you have and give it to the poor, and come and be poor with me." And the man left him crying, for he was rich and really hated to give up his riches. And I believe then we have a very famous quotation about camels and eyes of needles that unfortunately is not in the Compileison. But the one thing that I want to draw your attention to here in closing is the amount of verbs of speaking that are not present in the biblical text. A man asked of him exactly what you are asking, and said to Jesus Christ, as the Gospels tell it. And sweet Jesus replied to him and said, and the man said and replied to our Lord, "I have," he said. So you very much have this emphasis on received orality. But I'll conclude that here with sort of encouraging you all to think about how we both read and transfer orality onto the written page, particularly in this great yet underexplored genre of medieval sermons and didactic texts. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Samira, for this fascinating talk. May I remind everyone that we're going to have the discussion after our second talk, which will be delivered by Dr. Lindstedt-Pitcher, who completed a thesis on a prosodic model for Tiberian Hebrew in 2020 at the University of the Free State. She's currently a research fellow there in the Hebrew department, if I'm not wrong. And her research focuses on developing a new linguistic model for the accentual systems of the Hebrew Bible. And I believe that's what she's going to talk us about, namely the accentual notations of the Masoretic texts. And since I don't want to pronounce those words in Hebrew, I'll just leave the floor to her and ask her to take it away from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Domenico, and thank you to the entire ETC board for inviting me to share today on the textual sounds of orality. And thank you, Samira, for your paper, your very interesting paper. Here, get the... So my paper is entitled The Medieval Prosodic Orthography of the Tiberian Hebrew, the Tiberian Masoretic Text. My text of study is the Hebrew Bible, particularly the medieval manuscripts that preserve the text's full vocalization, including its vowels and accentual diacritics. This collection of medieval manuscripts is called the Masoretic text because these manuscripts were produced by scribal scholars known as Masoretes. Prior to the Masoretic period, biblical Hebrew manuscripts were comprised of a consonantal text, including consonants that indicated the presence of long vowels. The Masoretic period begins to emerge around 600 CE, when the Masoretes began innovating systems of notation to indicate and thereby preserve the full vocalization of the biblical text. In this slide, we can see the system of vocalic notation. These marks come in the form of lines and pointings in various configurations, primarily below the consonants. The next slide shows a system of accentual notation. These graphemes are more evenly distributed above and below the text. However, unlike vowel graphemes that mark syllables, the accentual notations mark words. So here we can see one accentual grapheme for each prosodic word. Masoretic texts, as a collection of manuscripts, comprise three distinct traditions of scribal practice: the Tiberian tradition, the Palestinian tradition, and the Babylonian tradition. The textual tradition of Tiberias, a major Jewish center along the western coast of the Sea of Galilee, emerged as the authoritative tradition of the Hebrew scriptures because it constituted the most sophisticated and complete system of notation. So this presentation focuses on the Tiberian Masoretic text and its particular system of accentual notation. Now, as we consider the writing innovations that the Tiberian Masoretes left us, it's important to keep in mind their purpose for devising these notations. Masoretes were foremostly dedicated to the preservation of the received oral and written traditions of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible, compiled over a millennium, is a written record of an essentially oral text, and according to Milanodia and Nodia, the Hebrew Bible is the fossil remains of living oral performances. So the core intent of these Masoretic writing innovations was to preserve and guard the transmission of the oral performances of the biblical text. Now that we have an overview of the text and the innovators of the writing system, let's take a closer look at the system itself. What exactly is it? Traditionally, the system of accentual notation is called the ta'ame hamikra. The graphemes that make up these symbols represent the melodies or tones that are used when reading the text, that is, when cantillating or chanting the text in liturgical settings. The ta'ame hamikra consists of 26 graphemes called ta'amim. There are two types of ta'amim, conjunctive ta'amim and disjunctive ta'amim. Conjunctive ta'amim are understood to conjoin prosodic words within a phrase, while disjunctive ta'amim are traditionally understood to signal pause, thereby marking the ends of cohesive phrases. Ta'am, the singular form of ta'amim, means taste or reason, alluding to its primary function of clarifying the meaning of the text. Now, my claim is that the ta'ame hamikra are a prosodic orthography of Tiberian Hebrew liturgical speech. But before we look at the evidence that supports this claim, let's define prosody. Very simply, prosody is the music of speech. It's all that encompasses the way we say what we say, the way we shape or phrase an utterance with things like intonation, segmentation, and stress. More technically, prosody is the autosegmental system of phonological features and structures that regulates intonational meaning above the word, or intonational meaning not associated with the lexeme. It's a system that interfaces with a variety of grammatical structures, including syntax and discourse pragmatics. Now let's take a look at what is meant by phonological features of prosody. The phonological features of a prosodic system are the meaningful contrastive features of the system based on phonetic realizations. Himmelman and Ladd define the phonetic features of prosody as pitch, duration of phonetic segments, voice quality, and stress. Pitch is defined as the property that distinguishes one musical note from another, corresponding roughly to the fundamental frequency of the acoustic signal, which corresponds roughly to the rate of vibration of the vocal cords. The duration of phonetic segments is measured by the extent to which an utterance can be divided into phonetic segments with clearly defined boundaries. Voice quality describes non-modal, that is non-melodic characteristics of the voice, for example, harsh, breathy, creaky, produced by different configurations of the glottis. Stress is the property that makes one syllable in a word more prominent than its neighbors, that is intensity or loudness, which serve to distinguish one word from another. As in the case, one that is more prominent than its neighbors, its intensity or loudness. Now, all of these features of prosody exclude the features that are determined in the lexicon, which serve to distinguish one word from another, as is the case with lexical tone of languages like Chinese. The above features, along with the post-lexical meaning associated with intonation and the linguistic structuring of intonation within the categorically distinct structural domains of the prosodic hierarchy, all constitute the defining characteristics of prosody. Grammars of all languages are based on a universal set of intonational features, and all speakers use the same means of articulation to produce the contrasted intonational features of their languages. The phonological structure of a prosodic system is conceptualized as an independent string of intonational segments that are organized within the distinct structure of the prosodic hierarchy. These tones are anchored in the metrical structure by their alignment with prominent syllables. This complex structure is encapsulated in the cross-linguistic prosodic hierarchy. Ultimately, this structure organizes the lexical constituents of an utterance into an embedded phrase structure. The prosodic hierarchy consists of embedded domains of lexical constituents that produce an organized phrase structure for the utterance. The domains of the prosodic hierarchy within an utterance are the prosodic word, the intermediate phrase, and the intonational phrase. The intonational phrase is the domain of an entire tone sequence, which must be well formed in a language-dependent way. An intonational phrase consists of at least one pitch accent and one boundary tone. Pitch accents are the post-lexical tones on the stressed syllables of words. Boundary tones are post-lexical tones at the ends of phrases. We can see this prosodic phrase structure and metrical structure exemplified in the English utterance, "Good novels read easier." The phrase structure of this utterance has 4 prosodic words and 2 intermediate phrases, all within one cohesive intonational phrase. The metrical structure of this utterance is depicted in the grid of X's, which represents the locus of prominence, the locus and prominence of pitch accents. The strongest locus of stress is at the right edge of the intonational phrase, which also coincides with an embedded intermediate phrase. And as you can see, more embedded phrase constituents, like good and read, exhibit weaker pitch accents. An example of the prosodic phrase structure and metrical structure of Tiberian Hebrew is illustrated in the first verse of Genesis 1, Bereshit bara Elohim. Each prosodic word of the Tiberian text, that is, each word that receives its own stress, is marked by one of the 26 accentual graphemes. Both the conjunctive and disjunctive ta'amim under the consonants highlighted in blue represent pitch accents. These pitch accents mark the locus of stress in the word. However, disjunctive ta'amim are not only pitch accents, but they are also phrasal pitch accents because they mark the stressed syllable of the last word in a prosodic phrase. The first and the last words in this utterance, Hebrew is read from right to left, are phrasal pitch accents because they are disjunctives and they signal a phrase boundary. The ta'am on the first word, bereshit, signals an intermediate phrase boundary, while the ta'am on the last word, Elohim, signals the close of a cohesive intonational phrase. Also note that the metrical structure represented by the X's show that the phrasal boundaries are more prominent in the phrase medial constituent in the middle. Furthermore, the intonational phrase boundary at the end of the utterance is more prominent than the intermediate phrase boundary at the beginning. Now let's briefly look at the evidence that supports the claim that the ta'amei hamikra represent the prosodic system of Tiberian Hebrew. Evidence for this claim can be found in the traditional understanding of the three functions of the ta'amei hamikra, as these functions align with key features and functions of the system. The first traditionally recognized function of the ta'amei hamikra is that they represent the melodies to which the biblical text is chanted in the public reading. The melody of the ta'amei hamikra is this system's most salient feature. These melodies are inextricably bound to the text. That is, within a liturgical setting, the text is never vocalized without the prescribed intonation. According to Jacobson, there is no lexical distinction between reading and cantillation. Implicit in the concept of liturgical reading has always been the assumption that the text would be cantillated. Furthermore, cantillation is not included in the same conceptual category as other musical forms. Even today, most worshipers consider cantillation to be quite different from the art of secular singing. Moreover, within the synagogue, the person who chants the prayers is regarded as more of a musician than the person who cantillates the Bible. Now, Jacobson's description of the feature and functions of intonation within the ta'amei hamikra squarely aligns with the prosodic intonation as the essential melodic component of natural speech. The second traditionally recognized function is that the ta'amei hamikra indicate the locus of stress in a word. This function aligns with the metrical structure of a prosodic system, where pitch movements are associated with stressed syllables in the form of pitch accents. Although the melodies of the ta'amei hamikra are inextricably bound to the text, they nonetheless constitute a distinct or autonomous system apart from the text. That is, they constitute an autosegmental system that aligns with the metrical structure of the text. Therefore, unlike music of a modern song, which can be separated from the lyrics to yield a coherent and cohesive melody and beat, an oral performance of the Tiberian Masoretic text cannot be rendered without the proper intonation, and its music, which includes its rhythm, does not function apart from the text. The third traditionally recognized function of the ta'amei hamikra is that they shape the meaning of the text in some important way. Now, this function has been traditionally the most poorly defined and understood because the lack of an appropriate theoretical framework for the ta'amei hamikra has really limited our understanding of this function and our ability to explore it. However opaque, the intonation and phrasing that accompanies the reading of the text are understood to constitute essential components of meaning, such that the full meaning of the text cannot be communicated without the intonational system represented by the ta'amei hamikra. This feature aligns with the post-lexical meaning associated with the intonation of prosodic systems. So the individual features of the ta'amei hamikra, including intonation, segmentation, phrasing, stress, and meaning, are all components of natural speech and can be unified within a modern prosodic framework. Now that we've identified the reasons why the ta'amei hamikra are best understood as a prosodic system, let's look at how the orthography represents some of the features and structures of Tiberian Hebrew prosody. Let's start with some of the orthography's features. The graphemes of the Tiberian Hebrew orthography can be divided into three main tone groups: These tone groups are made up of intonationally and iconically related ta'amim, and taken together, they constitute the pitch inventory for Tiberian Hebrew. Here we have the disjunctive ta'amim classified according to 3 tone groups. The disjunctives in each of these tone groups are further divided into 2 types of phrasal pitch accents, those that mark the boundaries of intermediate phrases and those that mark the boundaries of intonational phrases. The tone group classification of the ta'amim are based on several iconicity and intonational features of the ta'amim. Let's take a look at the iconicity of the ta'amim first. The ta'amim iconically indicate that the 4 following phenomena. They indicate that related disjunctives are members of the same tone group. They indicate the relative contrastive pitch of the ta'amim. They indicate the embedded phrase structure of an utterance. And they indicate the domain of a complete tone sequence of an intonational phrase. For example, if we take the intonational phrase pitch accents of tone groups 1 and 2, we can see that the linear graphemes are members of tone group 1, while the dotted graphemes are members of tone group 2. Again, if we take the same graphemes in these 2 tone groups, we can see that the relative contrastive pitch for tone group 1 disjunctives iconically indicate low phonemic pitch, as these disjunctives are positioned below prosodic words, while tone group 2 disjunctives iconically indicate high phonemic pitch, as they are positioned above the word. So within the orthography of this prosodic system, we can see high and low phonemic pitch represented, which is a cross-linguistic characteristic of prosodic intonation. The repeated tone sequences of disjunctives iconically indicate which disjunctives form embedded intermediate phrases. For example, if we take all of the disjunctives that comprise tone group 1, we can see that there are 2 main levels of embedded phrase structure: low intonational phrases marked by disjunctives et nachta and siluk, and low intermediate phrases marked by tipcha and tevir. The tone sequence of low intonational phrases marked by et nachta or siluk will always show at least 1 intermediate phrase marked by tipcha. Depending on the number of prosodic words within the low intonational phrase, the order of the tone sequence will always be the tevir and tipcha intermediate phrase boundaries, followed by an et nachta and siluk intonational phrase boundary. The disjunctive ta'amim that mark intermediate phrase boundaries also iconically indicate that they are smaller embedded phrases within larger intonational phrases. For example, the tone group 2 disjunctive pashta is oriented to the left in the direction the text is read, indicating a continuation of the larger intonational phrase. Disjunctives that mark intermediate phrases share this conjunctive-like feature with actual conjunctive ta'amim, like mercha, that connect phrase internal constituents. For example, here we can see that the conjunctive mercha is oriented to the left in the direction the text is read, indicating a continuation of the intermediate phrase. Furthermore, if we compare these 2 iconically conjunctive ta'amim to zakef katon, a ta'am that signals the boundary of an intonational phrase, we can see that this grapheme is not iconically conjunctive. Its alignment is vertical, iconically indicating an end to the flow of the text and the larger intonational phrase. Finally, the ta'amim within each tone group are not only iconically related, but they're also intonationally related. Wix's general description of the pitch values of the ta'amim and Idelson's catalog of extant cantillation traditions corroborates my classification of the tone group 3 ta'amim as the highest tones, tone group 2 ta'amim as the high tones, and tone group 1 ta'amim as the low tones. Furthermore, according to Yevon and Wix, the general intonational contour of a verse with accents from each group would start at a high raising, exalting pitch that leads to an intermediate sustained high raised pitch and ends the verse in a low pitch. Idelson's description of the hand shapes of the ta'amim also corroborates the general intonational contour of a biblical verse. Also note that the general trend of this type of intonational arc of a verse going up and coming down parallels the natural contour of utterances. Note that the iconicity of the tone group 3 graphemes are more exaggerated or prominent than the tone group 1 and 2 graphemes, iconically indicating their prominence. Also note that unlike the conjunctive-like graphemes that mark other intermediate phrases, tone group 3 graphemes do not exhibit conjunctive-like features. Instead, their iconic features appear to go against the flow of the text, as if they're indicating that these prominent constituents should be vocalized in some sustained or dramatic way. In fact, the meaning of the names for these graphemes appears to embody the expression of prominence or exaggeration, as do the undulating pitch patterns for many of these ta'amim and extant cantillation traditions. Now, in order to see the layout of this prosodic phrase structure and tone group sequences of a Tiberian Hebrew utterance, I'd like to now draw your attention to my handout, which I will bring up so we can look at together. So in these first 2 pages, we have the tone group sequence structure of Jonah chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, although for time's sake, I'm not going to show all of the 5 verses. Here we can see that each verse or utterance generally cycles through at least one high intonational phrase indicated in yellow and one low intonational phrase indicated in blue, with the highest pitch accents indicated in pink often appearing at the beginning of one of these two types of intonational phrases. Hopefully your handouts will show this same type of, reflect the same type of color patterning. If it doesn't, my apologies. I'm not sure what happened with the transfer. But I've taken these 5 verses or utterances and divided them into intonational phrase tone sequences of the 3 tone groups. The intonational phrases within each utterance are placed on separate lines. So here I end the overview of the Ta'ameh Hamikra as a prosodic orthography, but I'd like to just now take a few minutes to share the orality features that the Ta'ameh Hamikra exhibit within a few more textual examples. Miller-Naudea and Naudea assert that memory is the most efficient in storing, classifying, and retrieving items that are mimetic, rhythmic, and bilateral. Repetition is seen as a critical means for identifying patterns and formulas that would facilitate memory. Oral style then promotes the memory of traditions and is characterized by mimetic, rhythmic, bilateral, and repetitive expressions. My claim is that the Ta'ameh Hamikra as a prosodic orthography reflect features of orality, including parallelism, bilateralism, rhythm, repetition, and mimesis, and that these features not only serve memory, but also constitute fundamental components of communication. So bilateralism, parallelism is the first of the 4 features of orality. We can see evidence of this feature in the prosodic phrase structure of the Tiberian Hebrew text. Typologically, there are 3 types of binary constraints that regulate the prosodic phrase structure of languages. These binary constraints are binary maximum, binary minimum, and binary, and they regulate the weight and the balance of the intermediate and intonational phrases. Binary maximum states that an intonational phrase, highlighted in green, may consist of at most 2 intermediate phrases, highlighted in orange, and/or an intermediate phrase may consist of at most 2 prosodic words, highlighted in blue. Binary minimum states that an intonational phrase may consist of at least 2 intermediate phrases, and/or an intermediate phrase may consist of at least 2 prosodic words. And the binary constraint states that an intonational phrase may consist of just 2 intermediate phrases, and/or an intermediate phrase may consist of just 2 prosodic words. And while they are exceptions, Tiberian Hebrew phrase structure largely reflects the binary max constraint. Two examples from Genesis are given in the handout. And I have the first one here in Genesis 19:8, the second one in Genesis 37:3. And just as an aside, for the examples that don't fit this binary max constraint, the prosodic theory can explain the constraint. Optimality theory explains why you have exceptions to those constraints. Rhythmicity is the second feature of orality. Like melody, all utterances have a rhythm or a meter. Rhythm is a form of temporal organization that plays a role in any systematic human activity that involves sound. We see this rhythm in stress time languages in the regular alternation of prominent and less prominent syllables, as well as in syllable timed languages where equal weight is given to each syllable. And actually, I believe French is one of those syllable timed languages. We see this rhythm, this feature is observable in Tiberian Hebrew in the alternation of stressed syllables marked by conjunctive and disjunctive ta'amim and weak unmarked syllables. There's also a rhythm that can be discerned from the more prominently marked syllables that bear disjunctive ta'amim, that is, those at phrase boundaries, and less prominently marked syllables that are phrase internal because they bear conjunctive ta'amim. Furthermore, depending on the syllable structure of a Tiberian Hebrew word, different pitch accent allophones are used. An example of this is illustrated in Genesis 4:10 and Exodus 32:18. Here, the allophone yativ that marks the word highlighted in red in Genesis 4:10 replaces pashta as it appears highlighted in Exodus 32:18. Yativ replaces pashta when the intermediate phrase consists of a single monosyllabic word or a single word with first syllable stress. The third orality feature is exhibited by the Tame Hamika is repetition. And for examples of this feature, just refer you to the repetition of tone groups on the first 2 pages, both generally in the type of relative pitches of the intonational phrases, highest, high, low, and specifically in the type of tone sequences of the individual intonational phrases at Nachta, Siluk, Rebia, Zakefkaton, Segol. The final orality feature is mimesis, or imitation. Miller, Nodia, and Nodia describe this feature in relation to speech verbs that are used to introduce direct speech in the pericope of Dinah's rape recounted in Genesis 34, and the adjacency pairs of this narrative that mimic dialogue and the opposing viewpoints of the characters in the story. A closer look at the patterning of the ta'amim within this pericope reveals that the repetition of a particular ta'am, namely geresh, the geresh intermediate phrase highlighted in red, is used to organize discourse structure or to mimic episodic structure of the narrative, segmenting and focusing key constituents within each scene. Now, we don't have time to go through each of these episodes right now, but you have the handout, you can take a look at it. And I also have more examples of these features in my thesis, my doctoral thesis. And this is where I end my paper. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and once again, Samira, for your fascinating presentations. I guess we've got now half an hour of Q&A time. I am going to post again in the chat the house rules. So essentially, we kindly ask you to type question, new question or follow-up in case you have a question or you have something to say about something that's been asked to the speakers. And then you can unmute yourself when I call your name. Also, I would like to remind the speakers that they don't have to type question or follow-up in case they want to intervene, on what is being said or asked to one or both of them. Yeah, obviously, if you do have any question, just type question in the chat.
I think we did have a question when Samira was speaking.
Oh yes, we had a question. We had a question from yes, Olgierd. So if you want to ask the question now, that's the right time.
Okay, I'm sorry for not. Maybe I'll try. This is a very simple question. What's the role of color in medieval manuscripts, especially in the manuscripts you're talking about? Is there any?
Okay, yeah, color. Okay, so color is often primarily used as a way of visually organizing the text for a reader and breaking it down. Of course, color can have many meanings, particularly artistic, but the main average manuscript uses it practically. So for example, rubrics and rubrication, breaking down text into colored ink, does things like separating out titles and headings, letting you know which parts of a text are important, letting you know where you should pay attention. I highly recommend you read Noel Phillips' Seeing Red, which is a paper on rubrication and manuscripts of Chaucer. This is a very sort of basic explanation because, of course, there are many kinds of coloring in manuscripts.
Is there any reflection of orality within color?
Oh, it can be. So, for example, in verse manuscripts that are written in rhymed stanzas in the medieval period, verse is often still written as prose, but in manuscripts where it's lineated, you'll sometimes see red wavy brackets linking the lines that rhyme to visually show you that these are lines that rhyme. But this isn't really my area of expertise. I recommend the work of Daniel Wakelin, who works more extensively with verse things. In my manuscript, the one I'm looking at specifically, underlining in red ink often separates Latin text from French text. So visually cueing to you that there is a change in language or that an authoritative citation, what medieval audiences might call auctoritates, is coming in. And the fact that the marginal citations are boxed around in red also highlights the fact that, one, they are citations. So for example, words that are typos and added in as corrections in the margin are not boxed around. So the boxing around.
Would you consider that there was some change of intonation when it was changed, when there was a change between French and Latin?
Oh, I see. That's difficult to say because it's difficult to know whether.
Until now, like preserved within orality of French.
Pardon? Sorry, could you please repeat?
It's a tradition of this kind of change of intonation when you start quoting, for example, from Latin.
I'm afraid I don't know specifically in medieval manuscripts because it would probably depend on the performer. A performer who was fluent in Latin might have a less marked change from a performer who was not. Or similarly, a performer who is more familiar with preaching in Latin might struggle to switch between Latin and French. So I'm afraid that I would assume it's too individual to make a general rule.
Thank you.
Siobhan. Yes, we can hear you now.
Hi. Yes, I was interested in the contrast between the two systems that were described in both papers. In Sophia's discussion, she was describing, it seemed, an attempt to fix the oral delivery of the text. To actually dictate how the text would be pronounced or performed. Whereas in Samira's
Siobhan, sorry if I interrupt you. Could you please raise your volume because we can't hear you very well?
Okay. Is that any better? I'll just go
right, that's better. That seemed better.
So I was just trying to contrast the system that Sophia was describing, where the oral delivery is fixed and dictated by the text, whereas in the text that Samira is researching, it seems that the oral delivery is modified according to the audience or according to the intended recipient. And I was wondering whether there's any contemporary discussion about the intention behind those two systems. So what is the purpose that those scribes or authors have in either trying to make the text permanent and prescribe the way in which it's pronounced, or alternatively in trying to kind of render it more vivid or more appealing to certain audiences.
Should I answer or?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Sorry. So the first thing I think it's important to point out, which is sort of answers the question for both of us, is that we're both looking at the punctuation of very different kinds of text. So the punctuation of scripture, at least the Middle Ages, is the punctuation of the word of God. And it's very much an idea of correctness. You want to be as correct as possible because you want it to recapture as closely as possible the biblical word and the authoritative word. Whereas in other kinds of texts, there's not this sense of standardization and authority simply because it's less pressing that the text is right. It's less pressing that the text reflects the word of God. And then, of course, talking specifically about mine with the idea of preaching, preachers were often instructed to be as sort of interesting and relevant as possible in order to ensure that the message of salvation that they preached was accepted by the audience. So we have the opening of the text, "May God let us do this for the salvation of souls." It's more important that you keep them interested to ensure they learn and listen than that you necessarily read it as clearly as possible. And Thomas of Cholpin, in his Summa de Virtutum et Vitiorum, his Summa of the Vices and Virtues, he was a Dominican friar who wrote some very influential preachers' handbooks in the mid-13th century, discusses both the things that a preacher must preach about and the role of the preacher in enforcing the commandments. So Thomas says, the role of the preacher is significator predicator, qui vincere debet populum resistentere mandatis domini in pravis operibus. The preacher who must conquer a people resistant to the commandments of God. The preacher must conquer their souls for God with his words. And then later he says, a preacher must debet enim predicator predicare adventum regis et praemunere populum contra adventum domini sui, quia horrendum est incidere in manus Dei viventus. The preacher must therefore preach about the coming of the king, and he must warn the people about the coming of their God, for it is horrible to fall into the hands of a vengeful God. So it's again the idea that you very much impress on your listeners the importance of what you were saying and to engage them as much as possible. And so having a more flexible system of punctuation, as we saw in the Bodley text, is a way of ensuring that you can modify its delivery to highlight what you think is appropriate as needs be. Whereas, of course, the biblical text as the word of God, you might not have this flexibility.
Thank you, Samira. I think that's an excellent way to capture the attitude toward the text. And I will add that at least in terms of how it's seen today in terms of cantillation in liturgical settings today, there is some license for music, for artistry, and for your own kind of individual performance style, and I think most cantors would say that yes, that you know, every cantor has a different brings their quality, their individual quality to it. But I would also say that there are boundaries to that, and there's definitely a prescribed frame to that the cantor works in. So and certainly from the standpoint of the Masoretes, they, like Samira said, we're trying to preserve the full vocalization of the text, so that we didn't have all of these new things coming in that were not reliable in terms of communicating the full meaning, the full intended meaning of the text.
I think we've got a follow-up from Ray on this.
Yeah, Sophia, could you just very briefly mention other systems besides the Tiberian system? Because I think that will help explain this too. That is much earlier vocalization systems.
So do you mean within like the Palestinian Babylonian systems? Is that what you mean?
Samaritan, Pentateuch, those kinds of things. Yeah, that would show that there was a variety of oral recitation means in the ancient world before the Masoretic text.
So my understanding of, in terms of what the manuscripts show, is that we don't have any systems where the notation actually indicates these vocalization types of prescribed vocalization of the script. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, we can see the layout of how the text is laid out, and that kind of gives us some hints to how the text is performed. And certainly there's lots to explore in terms of how these text, how the layouts of these different texts map to each other. But in terms of this kind of specific vocalic and accentual prosodic notation, we don't begin to see this until around 600 CE. And particularly with the Tiberian system, the Tiberian system kind of comes out of nowhere, whereas the Palestinian and Babylonian traditions, you have a more of a progression, and you can see the development in how these sort of a development in the manuscripts and how they started and how they started to progress. But the Tiberian system kind of comes out of nowhere, and in a fully notated system, we get this with the Tiberian system. So it's quite distinct, and it's like I said, it's the most complete and sophisticated system of vocalization, accentual vocalization.
Right, thank you very much. Then we've got Bernardo with a new question.
Which indeed it turns out to be a follow-up on this, because actually I was, well, first of all, thanks a lot to you both. And yeah, so I am interested in this gap that we always have between the author or the original composition or performance and this manuscript evidence on which you are you have based your conclusions. So I guess in the case of the Bible, this is a very long gap. I think it is slightly less long in the case of the Anglo-Norman texts, but so how does this affect the way in which you consider this orality? In other words, how far are you looking at the time in which these manuscripts were produced and used, and instead how far you look at the original thing, as it were? Thank you.
So I can't speak for biblical manuscripts, but I think the thing that's important to bear in mind about the Compileison, which is the text specifically that I'm working with, is that there are two factors. The first is that the Compileison is quite unique again in that it uses a lot of contemporary sources. So in addition to texts from the Church Fathers and scriptures, which are of course very important, we also have William Peraldus' Summa de Vitis Viciorum, which is composed around 1236. We have Raymond of Pedaforte's Summa de Casibus Penitentiae, which is similarly the first quarter of the 13th century. He shows the influence of Thomas of Chobham, who was writing in the mid-13th century. Ancrian Wissa was composed between 1225 and 1230, we assume, based on manuscript evidence. So although his sources aren't exactly removed from the tradition in which he was writing, so there's less likely to be a disjunct in the sort of sense of how orality is written versus communicated. The second point, of course, is the idea again of manuscripts. If you're talking about things like punctuating orality and reflecting orality on the page, the majority of sources in the Compileison are very, very ordinary in the sense that they are popular and widely available. As such, we can assume every monastic or fraternal library to have a copy, perhaps even one that was produced recently. So if you're reading, say, a 5th century patristic text, but that's in a 13th century manuscript with modern conventions, you can't really talk about whether you think that the conventions of writing the orality were different because they are they are reflected in what they read, much in the same way today as we might read a Bible punctuated with modern punctuation, even though the text of the King James Bible is hundreds of years old. So at least in the case of my text, I would say that it's quite difficult to ask that question because of the manuscript culture in which it was produced.
Right.
And Sophia?
I'm unfortunately, I don't know that I have quite grasped, Bernardo, your question, but let me see if I can. Are you asking? Go ahead.
Well, I guess I am asking because I am absolutely ignorant about the history of this manuscript notations about which you were talking when you answered Ray's question. So I guess how far is the Iberian system reflective of medieval readings as opposed to ancient original ones?
Yes, so that's the $1 million question.
I'm sorry to have asked that.
That's a great question, and I mean,
do we have any means, any avenues to at least start addressing that?
I think taking a look at, like I said, taking a look at the oldest manuscripts that we do have and seeing how they were laid out, and for example, Revel is a good one to start with that. He looks at the layout of ancient manuscripts and kind of the first evidences that we can see of these more medieval segmentations in the Masoretic text. He does find quite striking overlap in these manuscripts. Obviously, not entirely overlapped, but I think part of the difficulty in comparing is one. I think the Tiberian Masoretic tradition, I don't know, has been well described yet. I hope my thesis adds to that in terms of really sharpening how we understand these segmentations, what they're doing, and how they're working. And I think once we have a better framework for how they're working, I think we can go back and look at the more older manuscripts and be able to interpret those a little bit better to really understand how is it mapping what's there. So I would say first understanding what we have in the Tiberian tradition, because it's the most sophisticated, the most complete, and then really taking another look at these manuscripts to see what the mapping looks like, how they're different, that sort of thing.
Right,
but I would say that I mean, part of the Masoretes believed that they had the correct oral, the correct written and oral reception of the text, and they were transmitting it faithfully. They had received it faithfully and they were transmitting it faithfully. But so I think from the perspective of the Masoretes, they were convinced of the authoritative nature of what they had and what they were producing, what they were replicating and transmitting. But that's
right. A bit like us modern editors, right? Who often maybe a little overconfident. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah,
we've got Ray has actually posted something in the
yes,
chat about
yes,
the
absolutely.
examples of different
Shem Miller is
text.
Yes.
If I may quickly add some follow-up question, I mean, before I hand it over to Olgerd, who has a new question. I was wondering, when you mentioned the metrical structure, Sophia, of the text, right? You mentioned that, and I might have lost something there. And again, I do come from a position of complete ignorance about those traditions. But when you mention the metrical structure, do you mean the particular rhythmical measurement created in that context, you know, that produced the notation, you know, in that particular? And is there any way in that case to sort of, well, then reconstruct some patterns, even in the sort of original text, that they simply formalize rather than just creating them out of the blue? And I guess this also leads me to a question for Samira. I was wondering if the sort of punctuation marks that we find in medieval manuscripts do also reflect sometimes some sort of rhythmical patterns that we can reconstruct by analyzing, you know, single versions of the text, in which we can see that there are recurrent rhythmical patterns that we can then reconstruct through punctuation. So I was wondering, you know, if we know anything about that.
Well, absolutely. Medieval punctuation is rhetorical, not grammatical. It's punctuated to reflect the text's oral recitation rather than its grammatical structure and syntax. So the thing to bear in mind in the Middle Ages is that reading, even when privately to oneself, is allowed. You always read the text aloud to yourself or mumble it quietly to yourself. You don't read silently as we do today. So for example, in Chaucer's, I believe it's the House of Fame, the eagle who abducts Chaucer in his dream makes fun of him and says, "You sit there dumb as a stone looking through your books. No wonder you can't remember anything. You're not really reading." So absolutely, punctuation is very much to engage the voice as much as it is to engage the eye and the brain. And in my thesis, I actually compared the punctuation of contemporary but unrelated versions of the same prayers. So I compared the punctuation of the Urizen of Godalmihti in the Nero and Lambeth manuscripts and the punctuation of the Urizen of St. Marie in the Nero and Royal manuscripts. And the interesting thing, if you look at the Urizen of Godalmihti, is the fact that the text contained roughly the same number of punctuation marks, but the quality of the punctuation marks is very different. The Lambeth version has only 6 punctus elevati in the entire text, and the rest is the punctus. Nero has punctus elevati, punctus interrogativi, punctus, and they are all used for different rhetorical effects. So you can absolutely say that the punctuation of a text indicates both its meter and changes its meaning as well. This was something, of course, drawn out a lot more in depth and a lot more clearly by Sophia in her presentation. But it is very much the case that medieval punctuation is associated with rhythm far more than it's associated with grammar as it is today.
But is it just, sorry if I just, before, you know, I let Sophia speak, I was wondering also if, you know, this rhetorical segmentation is also accompanied by a properly rhythmical segmentation. If you can measure sort of, you know, in a certain way, you know, if you can sort of see that certain rhythms are repeated and they're sort of accompanied by the same punctuation. So if we cannot go that far, we have to simply recognize that, you know, we can say that there's rhetorical sort of segmentation, but we cannot say more than that.
So I'm afraid I don't know very much about the punctuation of verse because I tend to focus more on prayer texts, which are usually written in prose. However, an interesting example could be the punctuation of Old English verse. So Old English verse is not lineated, it's copied as prose. But in some manuscripts, such as, for example, I believe the Exeter book, the scribes will place punctus in between poetical half lines. So every half line is separated by a punctus, and it's this rhythmical, consistent punctuation that allows you to hint that, oh, maybe there is verse here rather than prose. But I'm afraid I would defer to people more qualified in the field of talking about medieval verse, as that's not really something I focused on extensively in my manuscript work.
Mm-hmm. Sure, thank you. And yeah, Sophia, my question for you was essentially, what do you mean precisely when you talk about a metrical structure? Is that something that those who created the system identified, or is it something that we can really sort of reconstruct regardless of that particular system?
So for the metrical structure, I mean primarily the alternation of strong and weak beats, and the which is, I mean, the metrical structure is also, it's not just the intonational patterns, but it's also the vocalic patterns and how they interact, and how, depending on how it's phrased, how those can affect each other. And you can see different forms of the same word with different different patternings. And I think I also gave you an example of that in terms of the different accentual marks that are used for different words depending on where they are in the phrase. So that it's kind of a complex interaction of the alternation of strong and weak beats, the interaction of the syllable structure of the word, the interaction of which grapheme, accentual grapheme is used to express that. So that's, and then how prominent all of that is, how prominent, and the rhythm that comes with that ebb and flow of prominence and yeah.
Sure. Thank you. I think we have one question from Olgerd, a new question in the chat. So Olgerd.
Yeah, I guess it's going to be a short question, just due to my lack of knowledge. I have to ask Sophia, is it, was it researched the way, of course, those texts are still performed until now, right?
What's that?
Those texts are still performed.
Yes.
Was there a research into the modern ways of performing as compared to what is written in the text? Among different groups, of course, and different traditions.
Yeah, so I tried to, in my MA dissertation, I looked at a particular extant cantillation tradition, and looked at how that tradition functioned. But in my doctoral thesis, I tried to really try to understand what could be gleaned from the orthography itself, as opposed to its various expressions in extant cantillation traditions. I also, though, in kind of forming my opinion about how to interpret these signs, I did look at the Idelson's catalog of extant traditions, or those that were used when he started cataloging them, or those that had representations, and could see a general pattern in terms of trying to classify the different groups and try to interpret what they were trying to represent in terms of their phonemic or phonetic representation.
Okay, thank you.
Right, do we have any more questions? If not, I have one last very quick question for Samira. I was wondering if there's any iconic punctuation mark or diacritic in medieval manuscripts, like some of those we have seen in Masoretic texts, or if any of these signs have been interpreted in a sort of iconic way by contemporary or later treatises.
Sorry, could you please define what you mean by iconic?
Well, for instance, we were seeing that high pitches are sort of, above the letter, something of this kind. Do we have something like this for punctuation marks in medieval text, or is it something that doesn't apply at all to the punctuation systems?
Well, the closest thing I can think of is that in some manuscripts, so in medieval scripts, you don't dot your I's. So for example, in words with a lot of minims, so for example, minimum, which is just minims, you might see a text with a small accent over every I in order to mark that the word is an I and not another U, or that the word is at numinim or something similar. Another example you have is one I talked about briefly in my thesis in an English text, the Cleopatra manuscript of Ancarina Wissa, where the scribe will write a faint accent over words that are diacritics in order to distinguish their pronunciation. So for example, he writes G-O with an accent D to emphasize it's God and not God or good. But this is a very rare case. And I can't say that I would see any other things noted with any consistency.
So my question then, because I was looking at your handout and you have a symbol like the caret symbol.
Oh, that is because the line is inserted from the bottom of the page. So they skipped a line and then they inserted it in. So my caret mark just reflects that. That's purely editorial. Sorry for not clarifying.
Okay. I thought you described intonational kind of pitch kind of.
Yes, so those are the marks represented by semicolons. That's the punctus elevatus, which looks like an inverted semicolon. And that indicates that the intonation rises, much in the same way that the top of the punctus elevatus rises upwards. In earlier medieval periods, you have the corresponding punctus versus, which is the modern semicolon, where the intonation falls at the end of a line, but that had fallen out of fashion by the mid-13th century when this treatise was copied. So
that sounds like that had some iconic features there.
Yeah, so I'm sorry if I misunderstood the aspect of iconic. I thought that iconic was relating to certain letters or words rather than to punctuation symbols themselves.
No, it's a symbol that shows that expresses by showing.
I understand now. So yes, absolutely. The punctus elevatus is the most common and obvious example in manuscripts that are punctuated. You will almost always see punctus elevati as the second most common punctuation mark after the punctus. You also, though rarely, have punctus interrogativi, which are question marks. You have them in this Compileison manuscript, but there are very few of them. The punctus admirativus, which is sort of the forerunner of the exclamation mark, is not used in manuscripts of this period, and it starts to become quite common in the late 14th, early 15th century. And I defer again to Parkes, Pause and Effect, who talks about the development of the modern punctuation repertoire in much more detail than I could.
Thank you very much. We've got time for a quick follow-up from Chauvin, and then we basically ran out of time, so we'll have to call it a day. But Chauvin, go ahead with your follow-up.
So Samira, I was just wondering if you or anyone has actually tried performing those manuscripts and if they sound weird.
Okay, well, I'm for one, I'm not the best actress, so probably not me. I don't think I would make a very good preacher, but that you can't suffer a woman to preach. So thankfully, I don't even have to worry about trying. But people do reenact medieval mystery plays. Oxford do them every year. They reenact plays to the medieval mystery cycle. An interesting thing could be to look at the manuscripts of the medieval mystery plays and see how these quite literal play scripts are punctuated. Unfortunately, I haven't looked at them. They're about 200 years too late for me. But that is something you could indeed look at. And I, for one, would probably defer to St. Paul in probably this and only this, simply because it gets me out of public speaking. But if you wanted to perform it, you could probably have a decent shot, particularly the Trinity manuscript, which, as I said, is incredibly densely and deictically punctuated.
Well, thank you very much. That's a fantastic way to close the meeting. So please join me again in thanking Samira and Sophia for their lovely and fantastic presentations. We will send the Zoom link for the next session very soon, so please keep in touch. Thank you very much again to the speakers and to all those who attended, and we hope to see you soon for our next meeting. Thanks again.
Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.